So hello everyone, thank you for the organizers for having me here, and thank you for the audience. I would really like for the presentation to be projected, please. I'll give myself a few seconds to see the presentation.
Oui, oui, c'est bon.
Okay, I cannot see the presentation, so that it will be difficult for me to follow if I can't see it.
Je vais essayer de changer au fur et à mesure.
I cannot see it. I cannot see the presentation.
Yes.
So I cannot tell you. Okay, excellent.
Yes.
I can see it now. Good. So if we please go to the next slide, these are the credentials.
Ah, pourquoi ça marche pas?
Next. Okay, so the topic of my presentation is all about the way Muslim communities have been deculturalized, and I'm having a small historical background, so I will contextualize this process, and then I will show how social media today, not exclusively but primarily, offer the opportunity to Muslim communities to oppose this deculturalization and practically the Arabization of Muslims. So starting with the timeline, I personally have cut the Islamic history into three parts. So in the first part, which is the 7th century, or up to the 7th century, we have the Arab Muslim caliphates, and this is important because here we have the political power is held by Arabs. And then we have two different ways of Islamizing populations. One was through the conquest. So those populations, and we will see with details later on, those populations that were conquered, they were absolutely Arabized. So they were stripped of their individual cultural elements and they became Arab. This happened primarily in the Levant and North Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia. On the other hand, we have these places where Islam was introduced through commerce, through Sufism, and in those places, which was West Africa and Asia, local cultures existed or coexisted with the Islamic element. So this is the first part of history. The second part is between 8th and 13th Hijri, which is 15th to 19th century Common Era, where we have the Ottoman Empire. And here is important to keep in mind that the political power of the Islamic world was in the hands of non-Arabs. And this is important. Now, a small but important element in this era is the emergence of Wahhabism. And I don't want to take too much time because I need to be mindful of the time. I hope that everyone knows the story about Wahhabism. Primarily was a reaction both to colonization, but also to the idea that Turks, not Arabs, were the leaders, the political leaders of the Muslim world. And then we go to today's, or let's say the last two centuries, 20th and 21st century Common Era, when we have rapid changes in what we call Muslim majority countries. We have the colonialism of European powers, and is the time where Wahhabism starts spreading too much into the Muslim majority world, and intellectuals and scholars of Islam start having this imaginary past when all Muslims should return. And part of this imaginary past, a very important part, is the Arab culture. So we need to be dressed like Arabs, we need to use the Arabic language, etc., etc. This part, this dawah, which primarily happens in the 20th and 21st century by Saudi Arabia, has become possible due to wealth, of course, and we will see this with details. So if you please go to the next slide.
C'est bon. It's okay.
Thank you. Next one. Excellent. So here we see we see how Arabization in these places happened through trade and Sufism, practically. So we have a historian, Al-Battuta, which is very famous, a Berber Muslim, fully Arabized scholar and judge. He lived during the Abbasid Caliphate, and he traveled the then known Muslim world. So Battuta describes vividly his shock when he visited Mauritania, and then a Qadi, a local Muslim judge, he was spending time privately with a female friend, and also Battuta was shocked by the way the Mauritanian Muslim women were being dressed. And he vocalized that. He actually scolded the judge, and the response that Battuta took from the locals, including the Qadi, was that these are our customs, our women are different than your women, so we can both be Muslims and keep our culture intact. Which of course Battuta was not very happy with this response. But for us today, and Eva, if you please go to the next slide. So for us today, it is a very good example of how they kept their elements. I believe that we have missed a slide, but it's okay, I will catch up verbally. It's okay, I'll continue and I will catch up verbally. So this is one example of how some Muslim communities kept their identity while also being Muslim. Another example, if I stop the presentation, another example of the opposite side of how communities were being totally deculturized is the example of North Africa. So we have the Berbers there. And we know by Ibn Khaldun that the Berbers, for example, they didn't accept Islam and they didn't accept the deculturization of their own customs as easily. We know that Ibn Khaldun lets us know that Berbers, they apostated 12 times. And also in Egypt, which today is, if you ask any Egyptian in the streets today, they identify as Arabs. But we know that the process of Arabization was a long one. It took 500 years for this to happen. These elements show us how deculturation is not something that any community accepted willingly or as easily, but it did happen. At some point, local communities, they had to give up in the idea or under the influence that if you go against the culture, you go against the religion and ultimately God. So going to our modern era, 20th and 21st century, we had politically, and we will see how deculturation is primarily politically motivated. So we have this struggle between the Saudis and the Egyptians when it comes to authority in the Muslim world, comes to authority in the religion practically. And we had the two, in the 20th century, the two movements of Pan-Islamism and Pan-Arabism, which was purely political. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to put more about that in the presentation, but it will be in the paper that hopefully it will be published. So also another element that defined this deculturation, it's the wealth that Saudis suddenly had in their hands. And this wealth permitted them to let's say, perform dawah or proselytization in Asia and Balkans. And the proselytization that happened is not turning non-Muslims into Muslims, but it was turning Muslims into Arab Muslims. And we will see examples in the next slide, please, Eva. So the Salafi Islam, the Wahhabi Islam, which is Islam being practiced in Saudi Arabia, became the only true Islam. The case study that I chose for this presentation is the case study of Pakistan as a country, as a community. And there is a very good paper written by Hoodboy in 2017. It was published in the Routledge Handbook of Contemporary Pakistan. And we see here examples that Hoodboy gives, how names such as Talha and Firaj and Wael, which are Arab names, now are dominant in Pakistan and South Asia in general, whereas before that, they were not as common. And local names such as Pervez and Firoz and Shamim, they tend to not exist anymore. And from personal experience, I will tell you that I know someone being called Shamim, but socially is being called Muhammad. So even families that they kept or they tried to keep the names, they Arabized them. The extent to Arabization of Pakistan stretched to alteration of the environment. In the 1990s, there was this campaign of importing palm trees from Saudi Arabia and planting them in Islamabad, but of course nature did its job and the trees didn't survive for long. So we see how the names change, even the environment, there are attempts to change, and also clothing, which, parentheses, the clothing goes primarily to females because in Islam it's the female that carries on her shoulders the responsibility of being dressed as perfect Muslim or appropriately Muslim. So we see from Hoodboy, who states that 20 years ago, abaya was a word unfamiliar to speakers of Urdu and never had been seen. This shapeless gown, usually black, is of Arab origin, so it's an Arabic cultural element. But today, countless shops in every city of Pakistan specialize in abayas, hijabs, and burqas, while dancing and festivities are ascribed to the Hindu corruption of the culture. And Eva, if we please go to the next one. So we see how on different elements, the influence of Saudi Islam is changing or attempts to change the culture of Pakistan. Eva, can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So this is the contextualization of how the culturation happened in the past and how it happens today. It's something that is happening still. And we see how the resistance happens today. So we don't have information about the types of resistance in the past. It's very limited, our information, but for today we do. The primer element or the primer tool used for this resistance is social media. We saw already, I mean, the paper I mentioned from Hoodboy, it's a very good example of how this resistance is trying to take place in academia. But as we all know, academia is primarily for academics. So for the lay believers, for the lay Muslims, it's social media that makes the difference. And the four elements that I spotted in campaigns, or in sometimes it's campaigns, as we will see examples, but sometimes it's just spontaneous expression of grievances. So we see presentation, we see emancipation, preservation or effort of preservation of the culture, of the individual culture, and resistance to this Arabization of Muslims. Eva, if we please go to the next slide. Thank you. So the first example, or I have taken different examples from different parts of the world. The first one comes from Pakistan, where in December 2019, Mufti Abu Layth, which is quite popular Muslim preacher, he creates content in English. He mentioned, or let's say he touched this element of deculturization of South Asian Muslims in general, stating, and I quote, importing a lot of Gulf Islam, women wearing black burqas, replacing words. People refuse to say Huda Hafiz anymore. They just say Allah Hafiz. 2 years later, February 2021, a year from today, there was this decision of the Pakistani government to introduce Arabic compulsory as a language in schools. And at this period, we had several videos published primarily in Urdu language, where people were expressing their grievances and their opposition in this decision. They were creating parallel examples with Turkey and to what extent Turkey has Arabic language as a compulsory language. And also in one of these videos, there was a member of Pakistan's parliament that was condemning the decision. The fact that these videos were created in Urdu, it makes me personally as a researcher understand that they were not campaigning something outside the country. It was a real fear and a real opposition of lay people to the government's decision, and makes us understand that people don't really like that. I mean, all these examples of Arabization of Pakistan that we saw earlier, it's something that is being somehow forced down the throat of people. They don't really agree with it. But of course, the question here is to what extent can they oppose such decisions? Eva, if we please go to the next. Okay, another example from India, and this example comes from YouTube. It was a comment. So here comes the element of emancipation and how, when we have videos such as the video that I mentioned in the previous slide from a Mufti, so the Mufti's video where the Mufti was expressing grievances and opposition, then we have users that they leave their own comments expressing their own ideas, which we call it metadata in studying social media. And this is one of these comments where the user, it was a male user, stated, "I'm 100% Indian. My family has been since the beginning, yet we all have Arab names. Worst part is that Desi Muslims, Pakistanis and Indians, willingly accept their own cultural destruction." So here we start having the language being shaped appropriately to show the importance of what is happening and the opposition of this. The user continues saying, "When I suggested to my mom that I wanted to give my potential future children Indian names, she almost threw a knife at me," which is also important element in the sense that it relates to what I mentioned earlier, the extent to which lay Muslim believers can resist this stripping of their cultural elements, which we see it's not easy, because if a person didn't have the comfort to express such a wish within the family, within the comfort of the family, how this would be possible in the community or even in the context of the country. So we see that it's not an easy process, it's not an easy thing to oppose the loss of the culture, but they try to do it as much as they can. Eva, if we please go to the next one. Here's an example from Somalia in a video published in 2021 titled Arabization of Somali Culture. There was an abstract of an event organized by university students in Somalia to promote Somali culture. And the abstract that I chose specifically was where a young Muslim, a young Somali man actually, stated, "The culture of this country is missing. Where is our culture?" And he continued stating, "Let people know who we are before what we believe in." Now, the video continued with the students performing traditional dances in traditional clothing, which one could see that the clothing and the movements had nothing that could be deemed un-Islamic or opposing Islam or the ethics of Islam. However, so it could perfectly fit within the Islamic context. The people could keep their Islamic identity and their Somali identity and have them coexisting peacefully. And this is what these students were trying to do successfully, in my opinion. But we see how in narration of the nation, we will say, or the country, the one demands the erasure of the other. And if we please go to the next one. This example comes from Malaysia, and which also is a Muslim majority country, and is a country where lately a lot of Arab Islam is being imported. And from personal experience, I mean, 3 days ago, I was in Cairo, I returned 3 days ago, and I visited Al-Azhar Mosque. And to my surprise, the majority of the students, majority of the people inside the mosque, they were Malaysian students, that they had traveled to study Islam in Egypt. And then, of course, they will import this Islam in their own country. So the statement comes from Marina Manathir, I hope I pronounce it correctly, founder of Sisters in Islam. And she states, there is this idea that the more like Arabs you are, the better Muslim you are. That's the very real obliteration of our cultural heritage. So another cry about culture. If we please go to the next slide. This is the final example that comes from Afghanistan. And as we all know, or we are aware, recently, September 2020, actually, I think it was August 2021 when Taliban took hold of Afghanistan. Now, in September 5th, they imposed to female university students to wear whatever they called hijab, but then we had this this event that was organized by the Taliban, or that's what we believe, where hundreds of Afghani women filled the auditorium of Kabul University in burqas, in actual burqas, the burqa is what Taliban call hijab, which is not hijab, and Bahar Jalali is the creator of a spontaneous, I could say, movement that circulated in social media, and then it became so prominent that was also broadcasted by conventional media like newspapers and magazines and TV shows. The movement is called Do Not Touch My Clothes, and it's primarily, I think exclusively, women, Afghani women that live in the West, and they dress in their traditional clothes to show the difference. The statement says, what the Taliban were trying to do was to subvert Afghan heritage and culture, and here Bahar Jalali refers specifically to the event in the university when the university students appeared with burqas. I see clothing that is completely foreign to Afghan culture. Before we go to the next slides and I show you the visual elements of this specific case study. Okay, so here, this is the one. So this is the picture from the university in September 2021. We see how the students are being dressed, and all of us that we are Muslims and we know the different types of clothing in Islam, we know that this is not a hijab. If we please go to the next slide. So here are some examples, and I have secured approval for sharing them. So here are some examples of how Afghani women outside of Afghanistan, of course, for purposes of safety and security, they have promoted their own culture, the Afghani culture, showing that this black cloth is something Arab, and you can be Afghani and you can be Muslim, you can be modestly dressed, but colorfully, full of life, full of, you know, the individual Afghan culture. So these are the examples that I put in the presentation. One thing that I didn't put, but I would like to mention, and I was just trying to catch up with time, but now I have 1 minute, is how this deculturation, it is easy for us as researchers to spot it, identify it, and research it when it comes to countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan. One case that it is almost impossible to identify is what happens to converts. I happen to be a convert, and I know firsthand some of the requirements that Muslims or born Muslims have from us, and the most important is that they require we change our name. So the first question anyone asks me when I inform them that I'm convert, and a question that imams have asked me in mosques is, and what is your Islamic name? And when they say Islamic name, they mean what is your Arab name? Where we all know that, I mean, psychology states and sociology that our names are maybe the most intrinsic part of our identity / culture. So when we're being asked as converts to change our name in aim to sound more Muslim, this is also an element of deculturation. But again, as I said, this is something that it's more autobiographical and it's something I have discussed with other converts, and less, I mean, we cannot really make a case study on that as easily as we can when it comes to countries. This was the presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you found it useful.